everybody, welcome back. My name is Christina Wainwright. I'm the manager at the Pacific Beach Library, and I'm happy to welcome you to day 4 of our tea with the Count of Monte Cristo. We are reading, as you may have guessed from that introduction, The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. And as described yesterday, there was a lot of history going on. So I thought that while we drink our tea initially, we'll do a little bit of also talking about the history of France during the Bourbon Restoration and the Napoleonic era. So, and by the way, I'm cramming on this. I did a little bit of reading yesterday about French history, and so if any of you know more about French history and you want to share your commentary, I'm looking at you, Sandy. If there's something you know and you want to share, please do. I'm going to finish off my water, which I forgot to drink before I brewed my tea, so hang on just a second. Okay, water gone. Let's go ahead and have some of the tea. Today's tea is a loose leaf Earl Grey. It is the Earl Grey de la Crème that we've had before. It's delicious, and especially with the de la Crème, it seemed kind of French and appropriate for the Count of Monte Cristo. So let's go ahead and press that out and then give that a pour. I like this one because it has such a good fragrance with the little bit of vanilla in there. And an Earl Grey just always has a nice flavor on its own as a base. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what happened yesterday in the reading, and then we'll go a little bit more into why that mattered into French history. So, in yesterday's reading, actually, maybe we should talk about French history first. No, let's talk about what happened, then we'll go into why that, put it into context. All right, so in yesterday's reading, we read 2 chapters, chapters 5 and 6 of the Count of Monte Cristo. Chapter 5 was the betrothal feast, and in that one, Edmond Dantes and his fiancée, Mercédès, are at their betrothal feast at the restaurant with their family and their friends, and they're very happy. They're about to, they actually announce to their friends that not only is this a betrothal feast, they have made plans, they've made arrangement with the mayor, I believe it is, of the town to go ahead and get married within a few hours. They're going to walk into town and he's going to marry them that day. And so they're very pleased by this information. And they're getting ready actually to set out to go to the wedding ceremony when a gentleman comes and he says, I am actually here to arrest Edmond Dantes. And it's shocking. Monsieur Morel, Edmond Dantes' boss, says, there must be some misunderstanding. I'll follow you to town. I'll see if we can figure out what's going on. Even the gentleman who's arresting Edmond feels bad about what's happening, and he says, maybe this is just like a mistake. Something wasn't registered clearly when Edmund was declaring what was the cargo on the Pharaon, the ship. Like, it's probably just a technicality. You guys don't need to worry, but I have to arrest him. And so Edmund peacefully goes to go to town, to the magistrate. Meanwhile, after they leave, Caderousse, the friend and friend and neighbor of the Dantes family, he realizes that what had happened the previous day, that when he was drinking with Danglars and Fernand, that the joke that they had put together of pretending to denounce Edmund for treason had actually come to pass. That that he's pretty sure that is why Edmund is being arrested. That letter that Danglars had crumpled up and thrown away, that it really was picked up by Fernand, who has since turned it into the authorities, and that's why Edmund is being arrested. And Caderousse feels terrible about it. He says, Edmund doesn't deserve this. He's a good guy. We can't let this happen. We need to say something. And Danglars basically, eventually, he kind of shuts him up by saying, if there's a suspicion of treason against Edmond Dantes, and you speak up for him, don't you think there's going to be a suspicion that you are also treasonous? At which point Caderousse steps back and he's like, yeah, I don't even want to go there. And so he then is quite cowardly and he doesn't stand up and do the right thing. He just says, yeah, we shouldn't be involved in this anymore. It really wasn't our fault. It was Fernand who turned it in. We didn't do these things. We're not to blame. They are to blame, just to be clear. Then in the next chapter, we actually go to another separate betrothal feast. There's a gentleman named Monsieur de Villefort, who is engaged to marry a young lady named Marie Saint-Morin, I think is what her name was. And her mother and father, the Marquis and Marquise de Saint-Morin, are there, and they're talking with young Villefort, who's a magistrate of the town. He's the deputy procurer. He's like a attorney kind of for the king, and he is he's getting ready to be engaged to Renee. He's quite happy about this, and they talk several times about the royalists versus the those who are Bonapartists. So now we'll talk about history. But before we do that, sorry, let's go in one more thing. They do mention several times that they, of course, were royalists the whole way, but Villefort's father had been a supporter of Bonaparte, Napoleon. And therefore, now that Napoleon is out of favor, that is not the right way to be thinking politically, and that it's not in favor, and that, in fact, if there's any plots and things like that that come forward that are not supporting the king, that he needs to be especially strict about it because he has this history of his father having been a Bonapartist. All right, so, of course, in the very end of the feast, as things are wrapping up, here comes news that there's somebody who has been accused of being treasonous, conspiring against the king. And so, therefore, he needs to go, hear this case. And his fiancée, Renee, basically asks him to be merciful, that this gentleman who may have been accused is not guilty, he's just accused, and that, especially on this day when they're celebrating their engagement, she wants him to be merciful. And that's pretty much where that leads. All right, so now let's go back and talk a little bit about the history of what was going on. So Napoleon Bonaparte had come into power. He had become first the president and then the emperor of France. And then I'm peeking a little bit because I want to get my years right. After the French Revolution, he was elected first consul of France. He did a lot of great things for the country. In 1804, he crowned himself Emperor of France. The citizens loved him, but there were many members of the French nobility with ties to the former kings of France who hated Napoleon and wanted him out. Many of these royalists plotted to kill Napoleon in various ways. However, he was always one step ahead. However, over the course of several years, Napoleon waged war on many, many European countries. These were known as the Napoleonic Wars, and they were his attempt to gain more power both for himself and for France. Eventually, he invaded Russia in 1812, and if you know, like Tchaikovsky's the overture, like the story of it, as Napoleon waged war further and further into Russia, Russia kept retreating and burning the towns behind them. The French troops were trapped eventually by the Russian winter with no resources available to nourish them. And by the time they limped out of Russia, they had lost 400,000 men in that attempted invasion of Russia. So after that defeat in Russia, the other European powers were able to exile Napoleon in April of 1814. He was exiled to the island of Elba off the coast of Italy. And that's actually in the beginning of this story in chapter 1 when they refer to Captain Leclerc of the Pharaon having passed away, and he asked Dantes to run a quick errand to the island of Elba. He's going there to deliver a letter to Napoleon or Napoleon's faction. And so that's already casting suspicion on Edmund, even though it wasn't something that he wanted to do for himself, but was following out the last wishes of the previous captain. Still, Edmund is the one who did it, and that's why suspicion is being cast on him in this way. What's interesting is that in history, what they're saying too is that in February of 1815, and mind you, this story is set at the beginning of 1815, so we're going a little ahead. It's not going to change anything in real history, so it's okay if we have a bit of a spoiler for our book. In February of 1815, Napoleon escapes from Elba and flees to France. He returns to Paris and rules the French for 100 days in the period known as the 100 Days. He was popular with the French people, but his army was defeated by the European powers, and again he is exiled to the island of St. Helena, far away in the Atlantic Ocean. So the period then, this governmental period is called the Bourbon Restoration. And the Bourbon Restoration because it's the Bourbon family of kings. And after King Louis XVI had been killed during the French Revolution, his brother, King Louis XVIII, I don't know what happened to 17 in the middle, but King Louis XVIII is the one who is the king of of France between 1814 and 1824, minus that small period of the 100 days when Napoleon was in power again. Okay, so now putting this in context, where we're at in our story is Napoleon is still exiled on Elba. Edmond Dantes has delivered some letter to Napoleon or his deputies on the instruction of Captain Leclerc, the previous captain who had passed away. At this point in the story, we don't yet know what was in the letter or what's going to happen next, but we do have I think we've gotten enough clues here that there was another letter that the captain had handed to him, and that Dantes has been tasked with bringing to Paris to deliver to somebody. We don't know what's in that letter. We don't know who he's delivering it to. But again, putting in the historical context, there is a good chance it has something to do with what's, with Napoleon's plot to come back into France and to take his power back again. So I hope that helped getting a little bit of historical context. I will post a few links afterwards to some information about the Bourbon Revolution, the Bourbon Restoration, and a little bit more about just specifically the context of the Count of Monte Cristo. The tricky part with those sites, though, is that they also have a lot of information about the book and tell you the entire plot and all the characters, and I don't want to give away spoilers for folks, so I'm more going to post about the Bourbon Restoration, and maybe not quite so much about the specific context within the Count of Monte Cristo. Alright, so. That was a whole lot of historical explanation. I hope that helped set it in context a bit. If you do still have questions, post them, and I'll do my best to try to answer them either at the end or afterwards by doing a bit more research. Alright, so let's go ahead and read 2 chapters today, chapters 7 and 8. Yay, Judy, thank you. I'm glad that helped a bit. It helped me too, because I didn't realize that, well, spoiler, sort of, almost 200 years late, Napoleon's coming back into power, and that's what he's specifically plotting right now. And so that's the fear, and that's why there's this worry about whether or not Edmond Dantes is a treasonist. Because if he's conspiring to get rid of the king, that's what the royalists are worried about, that somebody's trying to depose the king, which is actually what Napoleon is trying to do. So it makes sense that they're worried about this, that they are concerned that people are trying to bring Napoleon back into power. So even though we know that Dantes is innocent, there are people who are conspiring to bring Napoleon back. And so it does make sense why there is such a concern and why people are so scared of being seen as being in the other camp, as Caderousse is. I mean, he knows that Dantes is innocent. He knows that he's innocent of this. But the fear of being tarred with that accusation is enough that he's going to keep silent. Because remember, it was only in 1789 that the French Revolution started, not too long ago that the guillotine was quite active, and none of them want to be, seen as conspiring against the king. All right, so let's go ahead and read our 2 chapters and see what happens today. Chapter 7 is called The Examination. No sooner had Villefort left the salon than he assumed the grave air of a man who holds the balance of life and death in his hands. Now, in spite of the nobility of his countenance, the command of which, like a finished actor, he had carefully studied before the glass, it was by no means easy for him to assume an air of judicial severity. Except the recollection of the line of politics his father had adopted, in which might interfere, unless he acted with the greatest prudence, with his own career, Gerard de Villefort was as happy as a man could be. Already rich, he held a high official situation, though only 27. He was about to marry a young and charming woman, whom he loved, not passionately, but reasonably, as became a deputy attorney of the king. And besides her personal attractions, which were very great, Mademoiselle de Saint-Méran's family possessed considerable political influence, which they would, of course, exert in his favor. The dowry of his wife amounted to 50,000 crowns, and he had, besides, the prospect of seeing her fortune increased to 500,000 at her father's death. These considerations naturally gave Villefort a feeling of such complete felicity that his mind was fairly dazzled in its contemplation. At the door he met the commissary of police, who was waiting for him. The sight of this officer recalled Villefort from the third heaven to earth. He composed his face, as we have before described, and said, "I have read the letters, sir, and you have acted rightly in arresting this man. Now inform me what you have discovered concerning him and the conspiracy." "We know nothing as yet of the conspiracy, monsieur. All the papers found have been sealed up and placed on your desk. The prisoner himself is named Edmond Dantes, mate on board the three-master, the Pharaon, trading in cotton with Alexandria and Smyrna, and belonging to Morel and Son of Marseille. Before he entered the merchant service, had he ever served in the marines?" "Oh, no, monsieur. He is very young." "How old?" 19 or 20 at the most." At this moment, and as Villefort had arrived at the corner of the Rue des Conseils, A man, who seemed to have been waiting for him, approached. It was Monsieur Morel. "Ah, Monsieur de Villefort," cried he, "I am delighted to see you. Some of your people have committed the strangest mistake. They have just arrested Edmond Dantès, mate of my vessel." "I know it, monsieur," replied Villefort, "and I am now going to examine him." "Oh," said Morel, carried away by his friendship, "you do not know him, and I do. He is the most estimable, the most trustworthy creature in the world, and I will venture to say there is not a better seaman in all the merchant service. Oh, Monsieur de Villefort, I beseech your indulgence for him." Villefort, as we have seen, belonged to the aristocratic party at Marseilles, Morel to the plebeian. The first was a royalist, the other suspected of Bonapartism. Villefort looked disdainfully at Morel and replied coldly, "You are aware, monsieur, that a man may be estimable and trustworthy in private life, and the best seaman in the merchant service, and yet be, politically speaking, a great criminal. Is it not true?" The magistrate laid emphasis on these words, as if he wished to apply them to the owner himself, while his eyes seemed to plunge into the heart of one who, interceding for another, had himself need of indulgence. Morel reddened, for his own conscience was not quite clear on politics. Besides, what Dantès had told him of his interview with the Grand Marshal, and what the Emperor had said to him, embarrassed him. He replied, however, in a tone of deep interest, "I entreat you, Monsieur de Villefort, be, as you always are, kind and equitable, and give him back to us soon." This "give us" sounded revolutionary in the deputy's ear. "Ah, murmured he. "Is Dantès then a member of some Carbonari society that his protector thus employs the collective form? He was, if I recollect, arrested in a tavern, in company with a great many others." And then he added, "Monsieur, you may rest assured I shall perform my duty impartially, and that if he be innocent, you shall not have appealed to me in vain. Should he, however, be guilty, in this present epoch, impunity would furnish a dangerous example, and I must do my duty." As he had now arrived at the door of his own house, which adjoined the Palais de Justice, he entered, after having coldly saluted the ship owner, who stood, as if petrified, on the spot where Villefort had left him. The antechamber was full of police agents and gendarmes, in the midst of whom, carefully watched, but calm and smiling, stood the prisoner. Villefort traversed the antechamber, cast a side glance at Dantès, and taking a packet which a gendarme offered him, disappeared, saying, "Bring in the prisoner." Rapid as had been Villefort's glance, it had served to give him an idea of the man he was about to interrogate. He had recognized intelligence in the high forehead, courage in the dark eye and bent brow, and frankness in the thick lips that showed a set of pearly teeth. Villefort's first impression was favorable, but he had been so often warned to mistrust first impulses that he implied the maxim to the impression, forgetting the difference between the two words. He stifled, therefore, the feelings of compassion that were rising, composed his features, and sat down, grim and somber, at his desk. An instant after, Dantès entered. He was pale, but calm and collected, and saluting his judge with easy politeness, looked round for a seat, as if he had been in Mr. Morel's salon. It was then that he encountered for the first time Villefort's look, that look peculiar to the magistrate, who, while seeming to read the thoughts of others, betrays nothing of his own. "Who and what are you?" demanded Villefort, turning over a pile of papers containing information relative to the prisoner that a police agent had given to him on his entry, and that already, in an hour's time, had swelled to voluminous proportions, thanks to the corrupt espionage of which the accused is always made the victim. "My name is Edmond Dantès," replied the young man calmly. "I am mate of the Pharaon, belonging to Messrs. Morel and Son." "Your age?" continued Villefort. 19, returned Dantès. "What were you doing at the moment you were arrested?" "I was at the festival of my marriage, monsieur," said the young man, his voice slightly tremulous, so great was the contrast between that happy moment and the painful ceremony he was now undergoing. So great was the contrast between the somber aspect of Monsieur de Villefort and the radiant face of Mercédès. "You were at the festival of your marriage?" said the deputy, shuddering in spite of himself. "Yes, monsieur. I am on the point of marrying a young girl I have been attached to for 3 years." Villefort, impassive as he was struck with this coincidence, and the tremulous voice of Dantès, surprised in the midst of his happiness, struck a sympathetic chord in his own bosom. He also was on the point of being married, and he was summoned from his own happiness to destroy that of another. "This philosophic reflection," thought he, "will make a great sensation at Monsieur de Saint-Méran's," and he arranged mentally, while Dantès awaited further questions, the antithesis by which orators often create a reputation for eloquence. When this speech was arranged, Villefort turned to Dantès. "Go on, sir," said he. "What would you have me say?" "Give all the information in your power." "Tell me on what point you desire information, and I will tell all I know. Only," added he with a smile, "I warn you I know very little." "Have you served under the usurper?" I was about to be mustered into the Royal Marines when he fell." "It is reported your political opinions are extreme," said Villefort, who had never heard anything of the kind, but was not sorry to make this inquiry, as if it were an accusation. "My political opinions?" replied Dantès. "Alas, sir, I never had any opinions. I am hardly 19. I know nothing. I have no part to play. If I obtain the situation I desire, I shall owe it to Monsieur Morrel. Thus all my opinions, I will not say public but private, are confined to these 3 sentiments. I love my father, I respect Monsieur Morrel, and I adore Mercédès. This, sir, is all I can tell you, and you can see how uninteresting it is." As Dantès spoke, Villefort gazed at his ingenuous and open countenance, and recollected the words of Renée, who, without knowing who the culprit was, had besought his indulgence for him. With the deputy's knowledge of crime and criminals, every word the young man uttered convinced him more and more of his innocence. This lad, for he was scarcely a man, simple, natural, eloquent with that eloquence of the heart never found when sought for, full of affection for everybody because he was happy, and because happiness renders even the wicked good, extended his affection even to his judge, spite of Villefort's severe look and stern accent. Dantès seemed full of kindness. "Pardieu," said Villefort, "he is a noble fellow. I hope I shall gain Renée's favor easily by obeying the first command she ever imposed on me. I shall have at least a pressure of the hand in public and a sweet kiss in private." Full of this idea, Villefort's face became so joyous that when he turned to Dantès, the latter, who had watched the change on his physiognomy, was smiling also. "Sir," said Villefort, "have you any enemies, at least, that you know?" "I have enemies?" replied Dantès. "My position is not sufficiently elevated for that. As for my disposition, that is, perhaps, somewhat too hasty, but I have striven to repress it. I have had 10 or 12 sailors under me, and if you question them, they will tell you that they love and respect me, not as a father, for I am too young, but as an elder brother." "But you may have excited jealousy. You are about to become captain at 19, an elevated post. You are about to marry a pretty girl who loves you, and these 2 pieces of good fortune may have excited the envy of someone." "You are right. You know men better than I do, and what you say may possibly be the case, I confess. But if such persons are among my acquaintances, I prefer not to know it, because then I should be forced to hate them." "You are wrong. You should always strive to see clearly around you. You seem a worthy young man. I will depart from the strict line of my duty to aid you in discovering the author of this accusation. Here is the paper. Do you know the writing?" As he spoke, Villefort drew the letter from his pocket and presented it to Dantès. Dantès read it. A cloud passed over his brow as he said, "No, monsieur, I do not know the writing, and yet it is tolerably plain. Whoever did it writes well. I am very fortunate," added he, looking gratefully at Villefort, "to be examined by such a man as you, for this envious person is a real enemy." And by the rapid glance that the young man's eyes shot forth, Villefort saw how much energy lay hid beneath his mildness. "Now," said the deputy, "answer me frankly, not as a prisoner to a judge, but as one man to another who takes an interest in him. What truth is there in the accusation contained in this anonymous letter?" And Villefort threw disdainfully on his desk the letter Dantès had just given back to him. "None at all. I will tell you the real facts. I swear by my honor as a sailor, by my love for Mercédès, by the life of my father." "Speak, monsieur," said Villefort. Then internally, "If a Renée could see me, I hope she would be satisfied and would no longer call me a decapitator." "Well, when we quitted Naples, Captain Leclerc was attacked with a brain fever, and as we had no doctor on board, and he was so anxious to arrive at Elba that he would not touch at any other port, his disorder rose to such a height that at the end of the 3rd day, feeling he was dying, he called me to him. 'My dear Dantès,' said he, 'swear to perform what I am going to tell you, for it is a matter of the deepest importance.' 'I swear, Captain,' replied I. 'Well, as after my death the command devolves on you as mate, assume the command, and bear up for the island of Elba. Disembark at Porto Ferrajo. Ask for the Grand Marshal. Give him this letter. Perhaps they will give you another letter and charge you with a commission. You will accomplish what I was to have done, and derive all the honor and profit from it.' 'I will do it, Captain, but perhaps I shall not be admitted to the Grand Marshal's presence as easily as you expect?' 'Here is a ring that will obtain audience of him, and remove every difficulty,' said the captain. At these words he gave me a ring. It was time. 2 hours after he was delirious. The next day he died." "And what did you do then?" "What I ought to have done, and what everyone would have done in my place. Everywhere the last requests of a dying man are sacred, but with a sailor the last requests of his superior are commands. I sailed for the island of Elba, where I arrived the next day. I ordered everybody to remain on board and went on shore alone. As I had expected, I found some difficulty in obtaining access to the Grand Marshal, but I sent the ring I had received from the captain to him and was instantly admitted. He questioned me concerning Captain Leclerc's death, and as the latter had told me, gave me a letter to carry on to a person in Paris. I undertook it because it was what my captain had bade me to do. I landed here, regulated the affairs of the vessel, and hastened to visit my affianced bride, whom I found more lovely than ever. Thanks to Monsieur Morel, all the forms were got over. In a word, I was, as I told you, at my marriage feast, and I should have been married in an hour, and tomorrow I intended to start for Paris, had I not been arrested on this charge, which you as well as I now see to be unjust." "Ah," said Villefort, "this seems to me the truth. If you have been culpable, it was imprudence, and this imprudence was in obedience to the orders of your captain. Give up this letter you have brought from Elba, and pass your word you will appear should you be required, and go and rejoin your friends." "I am free then, sir?" cried Dantès joyfully. "Yes, but first give me this letter." "You have it already, for it was taken from me with some others which I see in that packet." "Stop a moment," said the deputy, as Dantès took his hat and gloves. "To whom is it addressed?" "To Monsieur Noirtier, Rue Coq-Héron, Paris." Had a thunderbolt fallen into the room, Villefort could not have been more stupefied. He sank into his seat, and hastily turning over the packet, drew forth the fatal letter, at which he glanced with an expression of terror. "Monsieur Noirtier, Rue Coq-Héron, number 13, murmured he, growing still paler. "Yes," said Dantès, Do you know him? No, replied Villefort. A faithful servant of the king does not know conspirators. It is a conspiracy, then? Asked Dantès, who, after believing himself free, now began to feel a tenfold alarm. I have, however, already told you, sir, I was entirely ignorant of the contents of the letter. Yes, but you knew the name of the person to whom it was addressed, said Villefort. I was forced to read the address to know to whom to give it. Have you shown this letter to anyone? Asked Villefort, becoming still more pale. To no one, on my honor. Everybody is ignorant that you are the bearer of a letter from the island of Elba and addressed to Monsieur Noirtier? Everybody, except the person who gave it to me. And that was too much. Far too much, murmured Villefort. Villefort's brow darkened more and more. His white lips and clenched teeth filled Dantès with apprehension. After reading the letter, Villefort covered his face with his hands. Oh, said Dantès timidly, what is the matter? Villefort made no answer, but raised his head at the expiration of a few seconds and again perused the letter. And you say that you are ignorant of the contents of this letter? I give you my word of honor, sir, said Dantès, but what is the matter? You are ill. Shall I ring for assistance? Shall I call? No, said Villefort, rising hastily. Stay where you are. It is for me to give orders here, and not you. Monsieur, replied Dantès proudly, it was only to summon assistance for you. I want none. It was a temporary indisposition. Attend to yourself. Answer me. Dantès waited, expecting a question, but in vain. Villefort fell back on his chair, passed his hand over his brow, moist with perspiration, and for the third time read the letter. Oh, if he knows the contents of this, murmured he, and that Noirtier is the father of Villefort, I am lost. And he fixed his eyes upon Edmond as if he would have penetrated his thoughts. Oh, it is impossible to doubt it, cried he suddenly. In heaven's name, cried the unhappy young man, if you doubt me, question me. I will answer you. Villefort made a violent effort, and in a tone he strove to render firm. Sir, said he, I am no longer able, as I had hoped, to restore you immediately to liberty. Before doing so, I must consult the trial justice. What my own feeling is you already know. Oh, monsieur, cried Dantès, you have been rather a friend than a judge. Well, I must detain you some time longer, but I will strive to make it as short as possible. The principal charge against you is this letter, and you see, Villefort approached the fire, cast it in, and waited until it was entirely consumed. You see, I destroy it? Oh, exclaimed Dantès, you are goodness itself. Listen, continued Villefort. You can now have confidence in me after what I have done. Oh, command, and I will obey. Listen, this is not a command, but advice I give you. Speak, and I will follow your advice. I shall detain you until this evening in the Palais de Justice. Should anyone else interrogate you, say to him what you have said to me, but do not breathe a word of this letter. I promise. It was Villefort who seemed to entreat, and the prisoner who reassured him. You see, continued he, glancing toward the grate, where fragments of burnt paper fluttered in the flames, the letter is destroyed. You and I alone know of its existence. Should you therefore be questioned, deny all knowledge of it. Deny it boldly, and you are saved. Be satisfied. I will deny it. It was the only letter you had? It was. Swear it. I swear it. Villefort rang. A police agent entered. Villefort whispered some words in his ear, to which the officer replied by a motion of his head. Follow him, said Villefort to Dantès. Dantès saluted Villefort and retired. Hardly had the door closed when Villefort threw himself half fainting into a chair. Alas, alas, murmured he. If the procureur himself had been at Marseilles, I should have been ruined. This accursed letter would have destroyed all my hopes. Oh, my father, must your past career always interfere with my successes? Suddenly a light passed over his face. A smile played round his set mouth, and his haggard eyes were fixed in thought. This will do, said he, and from this letter, which might have ruined me, I will make my fortune. Now to the work I have in hand. And after having assured himself that the prisoner was gone, the deputy procureur hastened to the house of his betrothed. And now, chapter 8, the Chateau d'If. D'If? D''if. D'If? D'If? We're going to say D'If. Chapter 8. The commissary of police, as he traversed the antechamber, made a sign to two gendarmes, who placed themselves one on Dantès' right and the other on his left. A door that communicated with the Palais of Justice was opened, and they went through a long range of gloomy corridors, whose appearance might have made even the boldest shudder. The Palais of Justice, or de Justice, communicated with the prison, a somber edifice that from its grated windows looks on the clock tower of the École. After numberless windings, Dantès saw a door with an iron wicket. The commissary took up an iron mallet and knocked thrice, each blow seeming to Dantès as if struck on his heart. The door opened. The two gendarmes gently pushed him forward, and the door closed with a loud sound behind him. The air he inhaled was no longer pure, but thick and mephitic. He was in prison. He was conducted to a tolerably neat chamber, but grated and barred, and its appearance, therefore, did not greatly alarm him. Besides, the words of Villefort, who seemed to interest himself so much, resounded still in his ears like a promise of freedom. It was 4 o'clock when Dantès was placed in his chamber. It was, as we have said, the 1st of March, and the prisoner was soon buried in darkness. The obscurity augmented the acuteness of his hearing. At the slightest sound he rose and hastened to the door, convinced they were about to liberate him. But the sound died away, and Dantès sunk again into his seat. At last, about 10 o'clock, and just as Dantès began to despair, steps were heard in the corridor. A key turned in the lock, the bolts creaked, the massy oaken door flew open, and a flood of light from 2 torches pervaded the apartment. By the torchlight, Dantès saw the glittering sabers and carbines of 4 gendarmes. He had advanced at first, but stopped at the sight of this display of force. "Are you come to fetch me?" asked he. "Yes," replied a gendarme. "By the orders of the deputy procureur?" "I believe so." The conviction that they came from Monsieur de Villefort relieved all Dantès' apprehensions. He advanced calmly and placed himself in the center of the escort. A carriage waited at the door. The coachman was on the box, and a police officer sat beside him. "Is this carriage for me?" said Dantès. "It is for you," replied a gendarme. Dantès was about to speak, but feeling himself urged forward, and having neither the power nor the intention to resist, he mounted the steps and was in an instant seated between 2 gendarmes. The 2 others took their places opposite, and the carriage rolled heavily over the stones. The prisoner glanced at the windows. They were grated. He had changed his prison for another that was conveying him he knew not whither. Through the grating, however, Dantès saw that they were passing through the Rue Caisserie, and by the Rue Saint-Laurent and the Rue Taramie to the quay. Soon he saw the lights of La Consigne. The carriage stopped. The officer descended, approached the guardhouse. A dozen soldiers came out and formed themselves in order. Dantès saw the reflection of their muskets by the light of the lamps on the quay. "Can all this force be summoned on my account?" thought he. The officer opened the door, which was locked, and, without speaking a word, answered Dantès' question. for he saw between the ranks of the soldiers a passage formed from the carriage to the port. The two gendarmes who were opposite to him descended first. Then he was ordered to alight, and the gendarme on each side of him followed his example. They advanced toward a boat which a custom-house officer held by a chain near the quay. The officers looked at Dantès with an air of stupid curiosity. In an instant he was placed in the stern sheets of the boat between the gendarmes, while the officer stationed himself at the bow. A shove sent the boat adrift, and 4 sturdy oarsmen impelled it rapidly towards the Pilon. At a shout from the boat, the chain that closes the mouth of the port was lowered, and in a second they were, as Dantès knew, in the Frioul and outside the inner harbor. The prisoner's first feeling was of joy at again breathing the pure air, for air is freedom. But he soon sighed, for he passed before La Réserve, where he had that morning been so happy, and now through the open windows came the laughter and revelry of a ball. Dantès folded his hands, raised his eyes to heaven, and prayed fervently. The boat continued her voyage. They had passed the Tête de Mort, which now off the Anse de Ferro, and about to double the battery. This maneuver was incomprehensible to Dantès. "Whither are you taking me?" asked he. "You will soon know." "But still—" "We are forbidden to give you any explanation." Dantès, trained in discipline, knew that nothing would be more absurd than to question subordinates, who were forbidden to reply, and so he remained silent. The most vague and wild thoughts passed through his mind. The boat they were in could not make a long voyage. There was no vessel at anchor outside the harbor. He thought perhaps they were going to leave him on some distant point. He was not bound, nor had they made any attempt to handcuff him. This seemed a good augury. Besides, had not the deputy, who had been so kind to him, told him that provided he did not pronounce the dreaded name of Noirtier, he had nothing to apprehend? Had not Villefort in his presence destroyed the fatal letter, the only proof against him? He waited silently, striving to pierce through the darkness. They had left the Île Ratonneau, where the lighthouse stood, on the right, and were now opposite the Point des Catalans. It seemed to the prisoner that he could distinguish a feminine form on the beach, for it was there Mercédès dwelt. How was it that a presentiment did not warn Mercédès that her lover was within 300 yards of her? One light alone was visible, and Dantès saw that it came from Mercédès' chamber. Mercédès was the only one awake in the whole settlement. A loud cry could be heard by her, but pride restrained him, and he did not utter it. What would his guards think if they heard him shout like a madman? He remained silent, his eyes fixed upon the light. The boat went on, but the prisoner thought only of Mercédès. An intervening elevation of land hid the light. Dantès turned and perceived that they had got out to sea. While he had been absorbed in thought, they had shipped their oars and hoisted sail. The boat was now moving with the wind. In spite of his repugnance to address the guards, Dantès turned to the nearest gendarme, and taking his hand, "Comrade," said he, "I adjure you, as a Christian and a soldier, to tell me where we are going. I am Captain Dantès, a loyal Frenchman, though accused of treason. Tell me where you are conducting me, and I promise you on my honor I will submit to my fate." The gendarme looked irresolutely at his companion, who returned for answer a sign that said, "I see no great harm in telling him now." And the gendarme replied, "You are a native of Marseille and a sailor, and yet you do not know where you are going?" "On my honor, I have no idea." "Have you no idea whatsoever?" "None at all." "That is impossible." "I swear to you, it is true. Tell me, I entreat." "But my orders—" "Your orders do not forbid your telling me what I must know in 10 minutes, in half an hour, or an hour. You see I cannot escape, even if I intended." "Unless you are blind or have never been outside the harbor, you must know." "I do not." "Look round you, then." Dantès rose and looked forward, when he saw rise within 100 yards of him the black and frowning rock on which stands, the Chateau d'If. This gloomy fortress, which has for more than 300 years furnished food for so many wild legends, seemed to Dantès like a scaffold to a malefactor. "The Chateau d'If?" cried he. "What are we going there for?" The gendarme smiled. "I am not going there to be imprisoned," said Dantès. "It is only used for political prisoners. I have committed no crime. Are there any magistrates or judges at the Chateau d'If?" "There are only," said the gendarme, "a governor, a garrison, turnkeys, and good thick walls. Come, come, do not look so astonished, or you will make me think you are laughing at me in return for my good nature." Dantès pressed the gendarme's hand as though he would crush it. "You think, then," said he, "that I am taken to the Chateau d'If to be imprisoned there?" "It is probable, but there is no occasion to squeeze so hard." "Without any inquiry? Without any formality?" "All the formalities have been gone through. The inquiry is already made." "And so, in spite of Monsieur de Villefort's promises?" "I do not know what Monsieur de Villefort promised you," said the gendarme, "but I know we are taking you to the Chateau d'If. But what are you doing? Help, comrades, help!" By a rapid movement, which the gendarme's practiced eye had perceived, Dantès sprang forward to precipitate himself into the sea. But 4 vigorous arms seized him as his feet quitted the bottom of the boat. He fell back, cursing with rage. "Good," said the gendarme, placing his knee on his chest. "This is the way you keep your word as a sailor. Believe soft-spoken gentlemen again. Hark ye, my friend, I have disobeyed my first order, but I will not disobey the second, and if you move, I will blow your brains out." And he leveled his carbine at Dantès, who felt the muzzle against his temple. For a moment the idea of struggling crossed his mind, and of so ending the unexpected evil that had overtaken him. But he bethought him of Monsieur de Villefort's promise, and besides, death in a boat from the hand of a gendarme seemed too terrible. He remained motionless, but gnashing his teeth and wringing his hands with fury. At this moment the boat came to a landing with a violent shock. One of the sailors leapt on shore, a cord creaked as it ran through a pulley, and Dantès guessed they were at the end of the voyage and that they were mooring the boat. His guards, taking him by the arms and coat collar, forced him to rise and dragged him towards the steps that led to the gate of the fortress, while the police officer carrying a musket with fixed bayonet followed behind. Dantès made no resistance. He was like a man in a dream. He saw soldiers drawn up on the embankment. He knew vaguely that he was ascending a flight of steps. He was conscious that he passed through a door and that the door closed behind him, but all this indistinctly as through a mist. He did not even see the ocean, that terrible barrier against freedom which the prisoners look upon with utter despair. They halted for a minute, during which he strove to collect his thoughts. He looked around. He was in a court surrounded by high walls. He heard the measured tread of sentinels, and as they passed before the light, he saw the barrels of their muskets shine. They waited upwards of 10 minutes. Certain Dantès could not escape, the gendarme released him. They seemed awaiting orders. The orders came. "Where is the prisoner?" said a voice. "Here," replied the gendarme. "Let him follow me. I will take him to his cell." "Go," said the gendarme, thrusting Dantès forward. The prisoner followed his guide, who led him into a room almost underground, whose bare and reeking walls seemed as though impregnated with tears. A lamp placed on a stool illumined the apartment faintly, and showed Dantès the features of his conductor, an under-jailer, ill-clothed and of sullen appearance. "Here is your chamber for tonight," said he. "It is late, and the governor is asleep. Tomorrow, perhaps, he may change you. In the meantime, there is bread, water, and fresh straw, and that is all a prisoner can wish for. Good night." And before Dantès could open his mouth, before he had noticed where the jailer placed his bread or the water, before he had glanced towards the corner where the straw was, the jailer disappeared, taking with him the lamp and closing the door, leaving stamped upon the prisoner's mind the dim reflection of the dripping walls of his dungeon. Dantes was alone in darkness and in silence, cold as the shadows that he felt breathe on his burning forehead. With the first dawn of day, the jailer returned, with orders to leave Dantes where he was. He found the prisoner in the same position, as if fixed there, his eyes swollen with weeping. He had passed the night standing and without sleep. The jailer advanced. Dantes appeared not to perceive him. He touched him on the shoulder. Edmund started. "Have you not slept?" said the jailer. "I do not know," replied Dantes. The jailer stared. "Are you hungry?" continued he. "I do not know." "Do you wish for anything?" "I wish to see the governor." The jailer shrugged his shoulders and left the chamber. Dantes followed him with his eyes and stretched forth his hands toward the open door, but the door closed. All his emotion then burst forth. He cast himself on the ground, weeping bitterly and asking himself what crime he had committed that he was thus punished. The day passed thus. He scarcely tasted food, but walked round and round the cell like a wild beast in its cage. One thought in particular tormented him, namely, that during his journey hither he had sat so still, whereas he might a dozen times have plunged into the sea, and thanks to his powers of swimming, for which he was famous, have gained the shore, concealed himself until the arrival of a Genoese or Spanish vessel, escaped to Spain or Italy, where Mercede and his father could have joined him. He had no fears as to how he should live. Good seamen are welcome everywhere. He spoke Italian like a Tuscan and Spanish like a Castilian. He would have been free and happy with Mercede and his father, where he was now confined in the Chateau d'If, that impregnable fortress, ignorant of the future destiny of his father and Mercede, and all this because he had trusted to Villafort's promise. The thought was maddening, and Dantes threw himself furiously down on his straw. The next morning, at the same hour, the jailer came again. "Well," said the jailer, "are you more reasonable today?" Dantes made no reply. "Come, cheer up. Is there anything that I can do for you?" "I wish to see the governor." "I have already told you it was impossible." "Why so?" "Because it is against prison rules, and prisoners must not even ask for it." "What is allowed then?" "Better fare, if you pay for it, books, and leave to walk about." "I do not want books. I am satisfied with my food, and do not care to walk about. But I wish to see the governor." "If you worry me by repeating the same thing, I will not bring you any more to eat." "Well then," said Edmund, "if you do not, I shall die of hunger. That is all." The jailer saw by his tone he would be happy to die, and as every prisoner is worth 10 sous a day to his jailer, he replied in a more subdued tone, "What you ask is impossible, but if you are very well behaved, you will be allowed to walk about, and some day you will meet the governor, and if he chooses to reply, that is his affair." "But," asked Dantes, "how long shall I have to wait?" A month, 6 months, a year." "It is too long a time. I wish to see him at once." "Ah," said the jailer, "do not always brood over what is impossible, or you will be mad in a fortnight." "You think so?" "Yes. We have an instance here. It was by always offering 1,000,000 of francs to the governor for his liberty that an abbé became mad, who was in this chamber before you." "How long was he left it?" 2 years. "Was he liberated then?" "No, he was put in a dungeon." "Listen," said Dantes, "I am not an abbé. I am not mad. Perhaps I shall be, but at present, unfortunately, I am not. I will make you another offer." "What is that?" "I do not offer you 1,000,000, because I have it not. But I will give you 100 crowns if, the first time you go to Marseille, You will seek out a young girl named Mercede at the Catalan and give her 2 lines from me. If I took them and were detected, I should lose my place, which is worth 2,000 francs a year, so that I should be a great fool to run such a risk for 300. Well, said Dantès, mark this. If you refuse at least to tell Mercede I am here, I will some day hide myself behind the door, and when you enter, I will dash out your brains with this stool. Threats, cried the jailer, retreating and putting himself on the defensive. You are certainly going mad. The abbé began like you, and in 3 days you will be like him, mad enough to tie up. But fortunately, there are dungeons here. Dantès whirled the stool round his head. All right, said the jailer. All right, since you will have it so, I will send word to the governor. Very well, replied Dantès, dropping the stool and sitting on it as if he were in reality mad. The jailer went out and returned in an instant with a corporal and 4 soldiers. By the governor's order, said he, conduct the prisoner to the tier beneath. To the dungeon, then, said the corporal. Yes, we must put the madman with the madmen. And the soldiers seized Dantès, who followed passively. He descended 15 steps, and the door of a dungeon was opened, and he was thrust in. The door closed, and Dantès advanced with outstretched hands until he touched the wall. He then sat down in the corner until his eyes became accustomed to the darkness. The jailer was right. Dantès wanted but little of being utterly mad. And that concludes chapter 8. Oh, so the treachery of Villefort, because it turns out that the letter that Dantès was delivering, again, at the behest of the old captain, was a letter to Noirtier, the father of Villefort, who is trying to restore Napoleon Bonaparte to the throne. So that's where we're at right now in our story. Tomorrow is a holiday, so all the San Diego Public Libraries will not have our phone service available. I am going to go ahead and tape an extra reading for tomorrow, so if you would like to tune in at 3 o'clock, that will premiere then. I hope you have a great rest of your week and weekend, and I will see you with another video tomorrow. And if you want to tune in live, fresh again on Monday of next week. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.